A big welcome to everybody from mainly the UK, but some places in Europe. We may have some of our colleagues in Asia Pac. I'm not sure if any of our clients or colleagues from America have joined us, but you are most welcome. And if you are watching this later, a big welcome to you. And this is the beginning of our series, our impact series about resilience and its connection to three key topics that will be bubbling, being talked about, being chewed over in your organizations or your client organizations. So well-being, change and culture. So Amy, her research, her thinking, the pertinence of her thinking, the challenge of her thinking, you will hear today. Okay, an expert in well-being, been a long-standing researcher and practitioner in the field, and obviously been, with sort of keynotes everywhere. So you will really find, I think, Amy's contribution today and will stretch your thinking, will require you to activate something at the end of it and really enjoy that. You know a bit about me. I'm the chief resilience dynamic researcher and practitioner, and I have an incredible privilege to work with around 100 odd resilience dynamic practitioners who are trained and accredited in this stuff. And more so what I'm going to tell you now. So Ellie, next slide, please. That's great. Resilience. You will have your own definitions for this. Most of what we find in our research is that people talk about coping, which is a healthy place, bounce back, which is a slightly higher level, quite a significantly higher level of resilience, but has its ups and downs. And an awful lot in the general field is about toughening up, persevering, punching through. The hero of the moment is the person who makes it all the way through, who toughens up, who has grit. Okay, but our research shows something really very different than that. And it's much more about the capacity for change. It is about your adaptability. And that definition goes from individual to team to organization. Okay, so actually being able to understand how much change can you absorb and successfully enact on is what resilience is about. So it's a strategic capability in organizations. Ellie, can we go to the next one? The framework that we as practitioners, our client organizations really embed is the resilience dynamic. It's one of the research models that we have, and it shows essentially a scaled spectrum of different resilience levels. So you can see yourself in this individually. You would be able to work with your clients individually if you're a coach or OD practitioner. At organizational level, you can see yourself in teams, etc. And it ranges from breakdown, where there really is a massive incoherence in the way that you have been working and living, and burnout maybe is in part in there, all the way through to breakthrough, where you can be at ease with yourself, that you can feel grounded and safe, psychologically safe, no matter the context. Now that's a really big stretch because, and in Amy's book, you'll find, there's an awful lot about context and the building of different kind of contextual drivers. So, at the macro level, if work is not going well and you're in danger, if your personal life is more balanced, you have some kind of buffer to that and some kind of way of re-energizing. So really interesting that it's highly contextual, but at the very top end, and we know that people exist here because they have learned it and become it, the wise crew, one might call them, is that they are living in a way that's completely coherent to them. They could be very busy and stretched and energized, but they are at ease with where they are and who they are. Okay, so that's the framework. If you do want to know more about it, obviously you can read the book that we've published, The Resilience Dynamic. So it gives you a framework for where we're at. Ellie, can we go to the next one? We have found in our work, and I've been working in this since 2007, and I think along with a number of people in this call today, we have discovered that it's not enough for people to kind of just dive into doing something about this stuff. People have got to actually really see their situation in true form, sort of reveal the truth about themselves. And so, Ellie, if we can just walk this through. Initially, they've got to see where they're at. That's at an individual, team, organizational level. Next, Ellie, they go to understanding what they can do about that. So there are very practical things you can do around resilience and well-being. And then at an organizational level, there are some very practical things you can do to balance up the demand versus the capacity for change. And the last one is, once you've got that going, there's a huge bit about aligning both of those, that demand and capacity piece. It's practical, it's real, and some of it is psychologically deep. Okay, so we adopt that, and we've actually, got case studies around doing that. Our most recent one is working with Google globally. We have been working with them for 2 years, and they are adopting a see, understand, and optimize it framework for their workforce. So it's pretty cool. Next, Ellie. Last thing to say about us is the way that we've been able to get that scale is by creating an application that allows people to see and track and get kind of support for where are they at. Amy and I were talking about it just before coming on, sort of potential red flags that come up if you're out of kilter between that demand and capacity. And we also have services around coaching, coach training, workshops, facilitation that allow people to activate that understanding and move from the understand to optimize. That's what we're about. We're delighted that you're here to join us, and I'm now delighted to hand over the reins to Amy, who is going to be speaking about burnout and burnout in organizations. So let's go to Ellie, the next slide. And over to you, Amy. Enjoy it.
Thanks, Jenny. And hi, everyone. I've been listening with interest at your intro, Jenny, and it was making me reflect back on when you invited me to speak on well-being. And looking at you and your presentation of resilience as a continuum is very helpful from where I also come from when we look at well-being and burnout. And when you initially invited me, I reflected for a moment and realized it would actually be a challenge for me to talk about well-being first. It would also feel incongruent in a way, because I've just spent the past 2 years researching the antithesis of well-being and seeing burnout essentially as the other end of the continuum, potentially that breakdown space that you talked about. So this is my starting point for you all today, to say that from my point of view, we can only come to understand well-being by exploring ways back from the epidemic we are currently seeing of exhaustion, of overwhelm, of disengagement, in many ways cynicism towards our work. And just by means of opening, and in a moment on the second slide, I would love to invite you all to reflect on where you're at on this continuum. I just want to say something about the crisis that is facing us in terms of our relationship with work. And many of you will see that reports of chronic stress and burnout appear almost every day. People are reporting working longer hours, facing higher workloads and more demands at home and at work than they've ever known before. And just to give you some statistics around this, some research that was conducted during COVID in 2020 across 46 countries found that 89% of people say their work life is getting worse, and 85% of them say that their overall well-being has declined. And just by means of introduction into how I came into this work in particular, from my work on compassion initially and also engagement, I was noticing in my work with leaders and managers that started during the pandemic when all of our lives were upended in some way. I was noticing a kind of a general theme of exhaustion, a general theme of people feeling overextended or overwhelmed, people expressing, particularly in coaching conversations, a crisis of confidence about their capacity to do the work. And what was striking about all of these descriptions was they seemed to be pointing towards the central features of burnout. And myself and my co-author put out a call for research participants on LinkedIn, actually, and within 24 hours, we already had 30 people from across the world. So this seemed to be striking a chord in terms of a familiar phenomena. And I'd just like to open by asking all of you to take a moment to reflect on where you're at personally, and invite you actually to use chat, if you would, to reflect on your own relationship with well-being and burnout at the moment. And if we could just move to the next slide, I have 3 questions for you, and I'll explain in a moment why those questions are so important when it comes to this topic. The first question is a kind of a simple one. I just wonder how many of you tend to check your work phone while you're in bed or at weekends, or even when you're on leave or on holiday. Okay, question number 2. Do you tend to worry about work on your days off? Even in the evenings, when you're not physically clocked on? And the third question, how many of you feel too busy to take a break? The reason I've asked, and if you've answered yes to most, if not all of these questions, you're not alone. Research suggests that over half of the global working population now consider themselves workaholics, with the main indicators of workaholism being checking your phone when you're not at work, worrying about work when you're not there, or often feeling too busy to take a break. And I just want to say something about that, because one of the causes that we've found in our research for the malaise we have around this relationship with work is that overwork has become a way of life for many of us. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. You know, if we're not exhausted, then maybe we're not working hard enough. There's an inner narrative about the relationship between how hard we work and who we are and our kind of sense of self-worth. So let me tell you a little bit more about what's going on. If we just look at the next slide, I'm going to give you 4 statistics here. The first one is taken from Gallup's most recent global State of the Workplace report. 20% of us across 155 countries get up in the morning and look forward to going to work. So essentially what that's saying is 8 in 10 of us have a problematic relationship with our work for whatever reason. This lack of engagement costs the global economy $8 trillion a year. And the statistics in the UK, for those of you who are based in the UK, are even lower at 11%. Gallup has discovered that negative emotions in relation to our work have been on the rise in the past decade. Worry, stress, anger, sadness reached record levels in 2020, and 7 in 10 employees are now struggling or suffering rather than thriving in their lives overall. So it's not surprising, therefore, that your answer to the second question around worrying about work on your days off was so prevalently positive. The answer for many of you was yes. The second statistic I want to show you is from an Economist study last year. And this, to me, demonstrates the elongation in our working day. What The Economist found was that working hours increased by 30% in 2021, with over half of those hours being done outside of the normal working day. So our working days become stretched and blurred and beyond the boundaries that we would normally associate with our off time. The third statistic is about overextension at work. And this was our starting point for our research on burnout. And what's fascinating about this statistic, and this is from two of the leading scholars in this field, Christine Maslach and Michael Leiter, they have found that over 50% of the working population describe themselves as overextended. And if we see burnout and well-being on a continuum, with well-being on one end and burnout at the other, this point of overextension or overwhelm suggests to us that the majority of the working population are on their way to something that is unhealthy. They're on their way towards burnout if we don't take steps to address this profoundly. And finally, the statistic, this is from the American Psychological Association. They found that 79% of people had experienced work-related stress. So this is not stress in home life, work-related stress in the past month alone. And the reason that that last statistic is there for you is because I want to say, against a backdrop for many of us of deep uncertainty in our work environments at the moment, when it comes to the various global crises that are going on, many of us are working with a lack of information, a loss of a sense of control and autonomy, and this context of deep uncertainty, we know that these three factors are the main contributors of work-related stress. So, where did it all go wrong? We make some suggestions in the book based on our work with people who have been through a significant experience of burnout, who describe themselves as on the edge of burnout, or those who are in overwhelm when we worked alongside them over a 2-year period. Now, if we can just move to the next slide, what we've understood as the roots of burnout. The first is a mismatch between our expectations of work and the reality of our experience at work. And that can come in many forms. That mismatch could be around workload, for example, such as too many targets and deadlines combined with not enough resources to do the job. That mismatch can come from a feeling of loss of control or autonomy, such as feeling micromanaged, a sense of lacking influence or voice. That mismatch can come from feeling unfairly rewarded for our efforts, not feeling valued, appreciated, or even financially rewarded for the work we do. That mismatch can come from a sense of a lack of belonging, such as a feeling of isolation, particularly as we continue to work remotely, or that feeling of lack of belonging can be experiences of disrespect or incivility at work. That mismatch again can come from a lack of fairness, and that might be experiences of discrimination or favoritism at work. And finally, and maybe most importantly, a mismatch around values And what I mean by that is where our own values, motivations, and ideals bump up against those that are being espoused and demonstrated in our lived experience of work, a values mismatch between our own and those of the organisation, or what we're seeing or witnessing within the organisation. The second thing we found about the root cause of burnout was, and I mentioned this earlier, equating productivity with self-worth. And we talk in the book about this very complicated relationship with our work that has come through, in many ways, a kind of proletarian work ethic around, the harder you work, the more you become a good person. And this has become, for many of us, so ingrained that we measure our worth by how hard we work. And the problem with this is the very things that bring us a sense of worth can lead to our overwork and eventual exhaustion and burnout. The third thing that we propose in the book is that our work has become so central to our identity that we see work as the source of fulfillment in our lives. And of course, there are many other facets of us, our children, our volunteering activities, it could be our spirituality or religion, the activities in our life that nourish our soul that have become lost or forgotten in this kind of single pursuit of work as the source of fulfillment. The next thing we talk about in the book is the problem or the problematic relationship with our organizations, and in many ways our organizations being set against us when it comes to well-being. Growth and prosperity of organizations is dependent on an ever-increasing pressure on us as individuals to produce more and more and more. And ultimately, our organizations can only be as sustainable as our people. And finally, we talk about the result, perhaps, of all of these factors being that many of us are in a state of fight, flight, and freeze. Our autonomic nervous system is either stuck on, so we're in overdrive, exhausted, tense, ruminating, hard to switch off, or our autonomic nervous system is stuck off, that sense of joylessness, numbness, procrastination, withdrawal, lethargy towards our work. As part of our research, both in the stories of burnout and in bringing people together in what we describe as a community inquiry, we asked people, what has been helpful to you to find your way back from this? If we see burnout on a continuum with well-being at the other end, what is helpful for you when it comes to nurturing your own well-being in the face of burnout? And we discovered a range of practices or activities that have become personal customs for people. And if we just go to the next slide, and I noticed, by the way, in your responses in chat that there's a hint of personal customs coming through what you're saying in response to those three questions. Somebody mentioned walking the dog. A kind of personal way of holding yourself to account when it comes to your own well-being. And if we can put all four of these images up here, I just wanted to talk about all of them. First thing to say is all of these practices of nurturing well-being in the face of burnout are embodied. And what I mean by that is our bodies, our sense of our physical existence have become central to these approaches, because what we know from our research is that in burnout people become disconnected from their physical selves. In some ways they've almost forgotten how to feel. Their emotional thermometers have become turned down so much that they anaesthetize themselves. So that's the first thing to say. And this embodied set of practices, I'll just talk through. The first, we found the physical process of using one's hands to make, create, such as painting, photography, gardening, is an important source of positive energy that helps people in the face of burnout. And we know there's a whole raft of research around arts-based therapy in the face of trauma, for example. So this use of the physicality of using one's hands to make, create, paint, photograph, garden is something that we found as a nurturing practice in well-being. The second is sound. This is about music. Those people finding their way to playing music, listening to music, and also in the oral realm, people spoke to the personal regeneration found by a walk in the woods, listening to the sounds of nature. And we know that there are many studies pointing towards the positive effects of bird song on our mental health, for example. The third is stillness and movement. And what I mean by that is people talked about the helpful practice of meditation or mindfulness, and for others, their individual source of nurturing well-being was the explosiveness of running or kickboxing or swimming. So this sense of stillness or movement of the body as being a nurturing practice when it comes to our individual well-being. Next, as you might imagine, is connection to nature. And many people told us about the healing practice of enabling themselves to feel reconnected again. So many of us live behind a screen in urbanized environments. We've forgotten our connection and our sense of being tied to a greater system than ourselves. And time in nature, people talked about that being particularly a means of slowing down from the certain pace of work life, and in many ways bringing new perspective. And finally, and this was really interesting and unexpected in our research, was the power of talking to strangers. In this community inquiry, people didn't know each other, nor did they know their work roles, their backgrounds, their family circumstances. We brought people together purely because there was a shared connection to overwhelm and burnout. And people talked about how healing it was to be able to talk where there's no expectations of performance or role. There's no history, there's no future. It's meeting together in a particular moment to understand that you're not alone. And as a result of that, we've launched what we call Running on Empty rounds every other month that brings together strangers to continue this practice. My final slide is just to talk about the organisation, because what we learned from our research is that burnout cannot be tackled by individuals alone. We have to look at this as a radical reimagining of organisations, individually and collectively. And we asked people, okay, what would your organisation need to look like for you to feel that your well-being is fully nurtured? And some of the things people said, and we can put all of these up here, Ellie, is some of them are actually low-hanging fruit, I would say. So people said, I want to feel fairly rewarded for my efforts. I would like to feel that I'm compensated for the work that I do. Now, to me, that's a low-hanging fruit. It's something that we can tackle. The second thing people said is, I would like to work somewhere where there are processes that don't depersonalize and make me feel like a number, where I'm treated as an individual and as a human being. People said, I need to work somewhere where compassion for myself and for others is prioritized, even at the expense of productivity. They said, I need to work somewhere where the organization affirms that my purpose is going to come from all of the things that make me a whole person, not just my work. And that can come by us collectively in teams calling each other out when we see patterns of overwork, or calling each other out when we ignore self-care in favor of responding immediately to client demands. People said, my organization needs to start to become a listening system. And what they meant by that was that organizations and the people within them are constantly adjusting and readjusting to people's sense of well-being, anxieties. If there's stress, there's exhaustion, the organization is listening and responding. And finally, there was a whole conversation about power, about leveling up of power between the individual and the organization, where there's reciprocity. And somebody said, I want to feel that what I'm giving in is equaled and matched by what I'm getting out of the organization. And what we know on the research on reciprocity is that this leads to increased cohesion, belonging, commitment, ultimately engagement and performance. And organizations designed around reciprocity, such as hiring for relational skills, using participatory selection processes, focusing on group incentive and reward, not individual incentive and reward, this becomes a generative, enhancing sense of community and improves overall performance. Okay, I'm going to pause there because I know I've maybe talked slightly more than I would have liked, but I would like to leave time for questions. And Jenny, I can see a lot's come into chat which I haven't been able to look through, but please, yeah, open to questions.
I mean, I think thank you for this so far. And I think, this is really, really, I mean, even fair compensation in current climates right now, we have strikes, etc. So what is in your head potentially low-hanging fruit is already hugely problematic, in the current climate. I would love us to use the Q&A facility here, and for you guys to just pose any kind of question, whether that's for you individually, whether you're sitting with your clients in mind as a coach, whether you are thinking about your internal organization, about whether we as practitioners and interested parties in this field have a part to play in things like that reciprocity. So go for it. And I will start off, Amy, on this. And actually, I think one of the things that, I mean, this is hard stuff to hear and it's hard stuff to live. And I wonder whether you can give us some kind of light in this, is do you see and have you got examples of organizations who are doing this type of thing and actually changing, if you like, the growth paradigm around workload, etc., are changing the power paradigm so that it's more, equal reciprocity between employer and employee. And I'm thinking about stakeholders as well, because part of the pressure is shareholders pressure, etc. So do you have examples where this is actually being enacted on?
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. We found it, as I did previously in my research, looking for what I describe as consciously compassionate companies. It's they are few and far between. However, we do feature one organization called Noble Collective in the book, and I'd encourage people to take a look at them. They're a really interesting organization. They're fully virtual. So firstly, that kind of, to me, tackles the perception we have that some of this stuff is really difficult because we're not together physically anymore. Actually, this organization are fully virtual, and they have established what they describe as a cultural contract. They're a US-based consulting firm, by the way. They've established what they describe as a cultural contract that holds, themselves and those in the organizations equally to account, and they're the ones that talk about compassion for self and others being prioritized even at the expense of productivity. And there's all sorts of behaviors that they name and point towards where they can hold each other account in this regard. And I mentioned some of them when I was speaking. So if people in the organization see leaders overworking, then this is pointed out. If they see teams prioritizing responding immediately to client demands over self-care, this is pointed out. And there's an encouragement, and they actually say, this is fluid. This isn't something that then gets stuck up on the wall and not lived by. This is something we're constantly renegotiating month by month and learning from. So we talk about noble collective, but also what's happened with Patagonia, the organization recently, and also and the name escapes me, but there is a cosmetics company based in Scotland that have recently appointed somebody to their board who speaks for nature, which I think is fascinating. And so the next stage of this work that I'm doing and alongside Catherine, my co-author, is to think about sustainability differently, to think about personal sustainability being inextricably tied to organizational sustainability. So but it's a very long answer, Jenny, but just to say examples are few and far between.
And I'll just throw out a little bit, and we can discuss it offline, Amy. There's a whole movement of B Corp who are about this sort of world of making growth and breaking the cycle, more a circular economy style. And so they're very interesting for anyone who wants to know. I'm really aware of lots of questions coming in. There are those talking about, if you like, basically in the context, both Amanda and Elaine, in the context where, if you like, there's some kind of either badge of honor or there's people have given up. How do we help people get engaged again?
So yeah, that's it. So I think there's maybe in my mind there's two different questions there. There's one about the badge of honor, which I think it's maybe I'd tackle slightly differently, and there's one about re-engaging a disengaged workforce. The badge of honor, that sort of that whole productivity equals self-worth. I think it's up to organizations to look at how we incentivize and reward differently, because leaders cast a really long shadow here about people look to leaders about how they get ahead, and if they see leaders being first in and last out, and checking phone on weekends, then people take that signal and they see that as potentially a way of getting forward here. And if that's coupled with being rewarded, then we're kind of locked in this loop of exhaustion as a status symbol. On the disengagement question, and that statistic of 20% engaged, I do think that hides there's a lot in that, and I would distinguish between the actively disengaged and the passively disengaged. And what I mean by that is we see both in organizations at the moment, and I would say whoever's asked that question, that we need to sort of lift the lid on disengagement through individual conversations with people, because the passively disengaged, in my view and my experience, are those that we do have an opportunity to re-engage. They're the people who in some ways are the bystanders at the moment, the people who are sitting and waiting and observing and thinking about their future but not making decisions yet. Through good conversations, particularly with their line manager, who we know is the most important point for people when it comes to their engagement, line managers make or break engagement, essentially. That conversation is really important one at the moment, to try and understand where people are at and what it might be, because sometimes it can be just a small adjustment that helps people to re-engage. The actively disengaged, now they're a different kind of group, because in many ways they may have reached a tipping point where actually something has switched and there isn't a way back. The actively disengaged are those people in your organization who are most vocal about their unhappiness. We also know the actively disengaged from research tend to have higher levels of absenteeism, and they're those who monopolize managers' time the most. And so I think what I'm trying to say is, under that 20% figure, or under the 80% figure, I should say, there's a lot going on. And I do think there's hope for what I would describe as the passively disengaged, those people who are sitting and waiting, and what how powerful a conversation could be with them. So I hope that helps.
I think that's very comprehensive, and I think that's really interesting to understand. I mean, there's lots of different communities here, and just that clarification of our actively versus passively engaged, I think, is really powerful. But one of the asks in what you are saying is for organizations to wake up, to enact, to activate, to start to, I mean, you've said, the best way is to actually have a conversation and find out about the passively engaged, sort of what we can do, what's going on. And right now, I have to say that our experience within the resilience dynamic is people are, organizations are much more under the cost than they were during COVID. There are so many drivers about survival. And it can be stakeholder pressure coming in from, where there's a lack of growth or not hitting targets. But there's something more fundamental. Supply chains broken, contracts are broken, labour costs are increasing, supply costs are increasing. It's just so very difficult right now that I wonder, kind of in the middle of that, and I would say in the dynamic, you're talking about organisations that are no longer coping. Right, so the normal resourcefulness that you have in there is kind of locked and thrown away. Compassion is an interesting one to unlock, and meaning, of course, which you talked about a lot. So I just wonder, in this acute crisis, is there anything specifically that you've seen or experienced, or that you would say that organisations can adopt to help on this engagement piece?
I think what we are discovering, as we both from the research and as we're starting to go out into the world with this work, is the power of connection in community, the coming together of people where there's an intentional act of particularly deep and compassionate listening, even despite what's going on outside, in the world around us. This is hugely sustaining for people and enables them to get through the day-to-day. So just an act of human moments between people, and I don't necessarily mean in person, in teams where there's a sense of connection and community, helps people to feel that they're not alone. And that requires intentionality. It requires people in organizations just to press pause for a moment on the task. But it is something we can all do.
I mean, you're affirming, I think, for a lot of coaches and those who use a kind of coaching approach, this whole sort of key thing. So, I mean, it's lovely. There are another couple of questions. So Nicola has asked about, and it's quite a specific, but it's interesting with the hybrid working. So we accelerated working during the pandemic and working from home.
Yeah.
Now that people are looking for meeting face to face, there's no allowance for time to travel. You've got this kind of notion of back to back again. And in fact, we're, you know, although many people are hybrid working, the longer hours culture and not accounting for what's just happened before, what you have to do afterwards, is really strong. And Nicola's saying, how can this be tackled?
That, I think that for me, that reminds me of the Economist statistic about 50% of this increase in working hours being done outside of the working day. And do you know what? I don't have the answer, because I think it's such an individual and contextual response to this, because we all have different life circumstances. And I think one of the issues actually is well-meaning by organizations. You know, this, for example, there's 10,000 people worldwide now trialing a 4-day working week. Despite the enthusiasm towards this movement, research is also showing this simply creates pressure in different ways. So I think I want to resist an answer to this, because I think there isn't a one size fits all. And I don't, and I'm sure this isn't helpful for you, because I'm not giving you a kind of a single answer to this, but I would say, as individuals, it has to start with us more intentionally drawing the boundaries where we can. I think the one size fits all approaches that organizations have taken on in this regard are not helpful, because we know that our circumstances are all so different.
I think that's actually, I mean, there's a call here to leadership and to managers, line managers. I mean, you said, you know, line managers are the, you know, a massive part of engagement, and actually team by team, there's almost a sort of need for contracting.
Yeah.
No, lovely. I'm sorry for this. Another phone is just going off, but I do want to one more question, and then we'll bring our overall webinar to a close. So Yvette has asked about cultural differences, both, you know, if you like, the different regions around the world, but also genuinely the cultural aspects of things. I wonder if you can speak to that, and then we'll close our webinar thereafter.
Yeah, thanks for the question. And it's a very quick answer. And our view is that this is a human experience. It transcends cultures. This is about essentially what makes us human. And so COVID, by the way, was in many ways the instigator of this, that, you know, we are, whether you were in Dubai or Dubrovnik, this sense of a shared struggle came to the fore. And so we did have people from all over the world participate in the research, but it became transcendent to culture and something about us supporting one another as human beings, essentially.
Well, I mean, I think that's very strong, and it gets a lot of us thinking about that. Our own work has taken us to the Nordics, who have a different kind of view of economic kind of, you know, their whole system is set up slightly differently than, say, the UK, and very differently than the US, etc. So I think we can dig into that question much more. And you know, I'm very sorry to have to bring this to a close, but I hope that everybody who is listening, and maybe we stop sharing now, Ellie, we can say a big thank you to Amy for your work and for sharing yourself, and just, you know, how lovely you've been today in terms of sort of really sharing the stories and the thoughtfulness that you've come into this. It's lovely. Thank you to everybody who's been participating.